Welcome to this virtual conference on options for a sustainable Irish transport system, how to achieve carbon neutrality. I'm Brian Maguire. This event is a Euractiv media partnership organised by the Embassy of Brazil in Dublin and Apex Brazil in partnership with the Irish Bioenergy Association. You can follow this debate at hashtag EA Debates, and please tweet your comments using that hashtag. Our social media team will respond to you there. And to ask questions, go to the chat section and use the ask button. We'll bring those questions to the panel during the course of the discussion. You don't need to wait until the end of the discussion to send your questions. Do it as soon as you can, and we'll bring those questions directly to the panel experts. So in Ireland, the transport sector accounts for 40% of CO2 emissions. The Irish government has set an emissions reduction target of 51% by 2030, and this target will be challenging for the Irish transport sector. The Irish government is strongly focused on the electrification of transport as a decarbonisation solution. In addition to electrified solutions, significant volumes of sustainable bioenergy and biofuels, including ethanol, will be needed to achieve the ambitious 2030 decarbonisation targets. Brazil, however, is the second largest producer of biofuels in the world and has the largest fleet of flex fuel vehicles. For over 50 years now, cars in Brazil have been powered by sustainable biofuels that not only mitigate climate change, but also promote economic growth, social inclusion, and public health benefits. This webinar will focus on the solutions to the Irish challenge of decarbonising its transport sector and how sustainable biofuels, along with other measures, can contribute towards it, with panelists from Brazil, Ireland, and Sweden. And that panel today, we have with us Plínio Nastari. He's the president and CEO of DataGrow, the president of the Brazilian Institute of Bioenergy and Bioeconomy. Emily Rees from UNICA, the Brazilian Sugarcane Industry Association. Sean Finnan, he's the CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association. James Coogan, he's the Ethanol Europe. And Gustav Mellon, CEO of the Swedish Bioenergy Association as well. Great to have all of you with us today. Let me declare my interest in being Irish and married to a Brazilian. So some of these bases are covered already. The panel today, I'm going to give them 60 seconds approximately, just a little bit longer if you like, to give your opening remarks. And then we'll go into the panel discussion from there as well. Let's kick off with Sean Finnan.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks, Brian, for the introduction. My name is Sean Fine. I work for the Irish Bioenergy Association. We're the representative body for the bioenergy sector on the island of Ireland, and our membership covers the sectors of biomass, biogas, biofuels, wood fuels, and energy crops. Our role is to represent and advocate on behalf of our members and promote and develop the sector. I would like to highlight our positive collaboration with the Irish Brazilian Embassy, and also to the Apex Brazil organization for reaching out to RBA about partnering for this event. I would like to particularly acknowledge the ambassador and also Annecy and the embassy for their work in organizing this event, and also thanks to our media partners at Euractiv. Today we discussed about the Irish transport system. The government has an ambitious target of 51% emissions reduction by 2030. This does present a significant challenge for the Irish transport sector. In recent weeks, we have seen the publication of the Climate Action Plan. This does contain measures to increase the blending rates of biofuels. However, we believe that this ambition should be further increased, and also the timelines by which it should be implemented should be accelerated. The discussion on decarbonisation of transport at an Irish and indeed at a European level has predominantly focused on electrification. This discussion needs to be much broader. Full achievement of electric vehicle targets and indeed all technology and fuel options should be part of the mix in order for Ireland to achieve the 51% emissions reduction by 2030. There needs also to be a strong emphasis on the roles of ethanol, biodiesel and biomethane in contributing to the ambitious government emissions reduction target. And in the short term, there's potential for those blending rates for ethanol and biodiesel to increase from their current rates, and this should happen, in our view, straight away. There's also strong potential for biomethane, and recent, indeed, an EU Commission study did say that on an assessment of the potential of biogas from digestion in the EU beyond 2020, that Ireland has the largest potential for growth of this sector. So we cannot ignore this, and it needs to be implemented in terms of policy levers in order to make this happen, make this happen. To conclude, I would like to just draw your attention to the fact that Erbia has commissioned UCC Mari to develop a report in terms of renewables and transport. We will be launching that report next week. And in the period up to 2030, the report suggests that we should identifies 5 core policy areas that need to be delivered to achieve a 51% reductions in emissions. Those 5 areas include the achievement of the government's stated ambition of 940,000 electric vehicles by 2030, increasing the blending rates of ethanol and also biodiesel, efficiency and behaviour measures that can reduce surface transport fuel consumption by 17%, target of 5 terawatt hours in terms of biomethane production per use in heavy transport, and indeed an ambitious target of 2 terawatt hours of hydrotreated vegetable oils, HVO, following best practice in terms of the Swedish renewable transport policy. So I will conclude on this by just thanking you all for joining us today, and I look forward to being part of the panel discussion. Thank you.
Sean Feynman, thank you so much for that introduction. And let's go to James Cogan. James.
Hi, yeah, thanks everybody. Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Mr. Ambassador, to Apex and to Erbia. Yeah, my name is James Cogan. I'm with Ethanol Europe. I represent an Irish-Hungarian organization that produces around, I don't know, about 12% of Europe's ethanol. And the ethanol that we produce is about 80% less carbon intensive than the petrol it replaces in cars on European roads. And we also produce food, about the same amount of food as we do energy, because we produce our ethanol energy from European crops, and those crops also become food as well as becoming energy. I guess in terms of the context we're in now, in Glasgow 10 days ago, Mary Robinson called for a crisis mode approach to climate action and to halving carbon emissions by 2030. And if we zoom down into the transport sector in Ireland, that equates to having diesel and petrol use in transport by 2030, or 8% cuts every year, which is just an extraordinary amount. And coming back from Glasgow and getting back to, I guess, what you call the real world, you'd see that we're in anything but crisis mode. It's really, at least I don't see any of the signs of crisis mode activity. I mean, once COP was over, the whole discussion kind of faded from the media, and we're not seeing kind of crisis mode actions taking place in the field. This year, Ireland could well increase its transport emissions, and it could well increase them next year. So crisis mode would mean reversing that increase trend and using every available measure to the greatest extent possible. I mean, the IEA and the United Nations IPCC group, who are the ultimate authorities on climate change and climate action, calculate that bioenergy and transport would want to contribute between 15 and 30% of the energy in the sector if climate change is to be kept within the parameters currently being discussed. In Ireland, Ireland's transport system, which is consumes about 4 million tons of oil equivalent a year, about a bit over 1% of the European total. That is, and we've about 3 million vehicles, and essentially all of Ireland's transport runs on petrol and diesel. A negligible amount goes through electricity. That's mostly the Dart and the Lewis. And of that 4 million tons, 5% of it is renewable, and of that 5%, all of it is bioenergy. So that's ethanol and biodiesel. Now, there are some electric cars around, and there is a little bit of renewable electricity in the Dart and the Lewis, but the volumes are so small as to not figure. They don't move the dial yet. That's not to say they won't ever move the dial. They will, of course, but they're not moving the dial yet. So that 5% that's currently powered by bioenergy, that is highly carbon, not, the carbon intensity is much lower. It's between 80 and 100% lower than the petrol or diesel it's replacing, which is a very good result. And the volume of bioenergy in the system, so ethanol, biodiesel, but also biomethane in heavy goods vehicles and buses, could easily be doubled or trebled by 2030 with a kind of judicious deployment of those kind of fuels in the system. Now, to achieve this, like anything, there's no lever in the Department of Transport or the Department of Energy where you can just dial up more of this stuff. To increase the amount of renewables in the system and reduce emissions, whether it's by bioenergy or electromobility, requires massive effort by the regulators and the public stakeholders. It requires massive investment of skill and competence and analysis to get the right mix. But it can be done, and I guess that's what we're advocating. And we advocate getting down to work and getting to it this year rather than putting it off. Thank you.
James Cogan, thank you so much. Plinio Nastari, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Plinio Nastari from the Brazilian Institute of Bioenergy and Bioeconomy. Thanks to the Brazilian Embassy in Dublin, Apex Brazil and Herbia. And thank you, Brian. Well, I would like to say that there's a sense of urgency today in the whole world towards measures to control climate change. And bioenergy seems to provide a very interesting solution amongst other options at hand. It's scalable, it's replicable. There are no technical barriers really to implement it. It's affordable to consumers. And in fact, it calls for the declaration of vision, which was set in COP23 in Bonn, issued by countries that represent over 50% of the world's population and endorsed by the International Energy Agency and IRENA, saying that bioenergy as a proportion of world energy demand must double until 2030 in order to achieve the target of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And sustainable biofuels must triple in the same horizon to 2030 in land, sea, and air to achieve the same target. Brazil's experience in that regard, where 48% of auto-cycle fuels are being substituted by ethanol, 13% of diesel is being substituted by biodiesel, and there's a huge potential for biomethane, provide a very good example that with very little land, in Brazil, in fact, with only 0.6% of Brazil's territory, all this is being achieved in a certified way, guaranteeing that there's zero deforestation and there is an incentive for increased efficiency in energy and environmental terms. This experience shows that it's doable and that there is automotive technology that is capable of using sustainable biofuels, which is capable of meeting the most restrictive emission limits. Therefore, today, even the so-called primitive internal combustion engines are emitting much less than the electrified battery electric vehicles, which are so fashionable today in many countries. When you look at the life cycle assessment and not only the tailpipe emissions. So it's very important that you recognize the importance of choosing the right path to choose which is the best combination of fuel and motorization to achieve decarbonisation in transport. So the Brazilian experience, the potential that exists in many countries, including Ireland, indicate that when people seek hydrogen as a solution, we have hydrogen at hand, easy to transport, store, and distribute through sustainably produced biofuels like ethanol and biomethane. And I think today we'll have a host of opportunities to discuss how this can evolve, not only in Brazil, but in Ireland and many parts of the world, like it is happening in India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Thank you.
Nastari, thank you so much. Lots of great points there. We'll pick up on those in the discussion in just a moment. Emily Rees, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian, and to the Embassy of Brazil in Ireland, Apex Brazil, the Irish Bioenergy Association, for convening this very timely discussion. I'm here representing UNICA, the Brazilian Sugarcane Industry Association, and we are the leading trade association for sugarcane industry in Brazil. And that's representing around 55% of the country's sugarcane production and processing, 60% of ethanol production, nearly 70% of all the bioelectricity that feeds into the national grid. During the last harvest, the 2020-2021 harvest, Brazil produced approximately 657 million tons of sugarcane. So that's the raw material that's used to produce over 41 million tons of sugar, and also 32.5 billion liters of ethanol, as well as we mentioned, quite a lot of bioelectricity that feeds into the Brazilian national grid. So sugarcane ethanol in Brazil has already been decarbonizing transport systems in the country. It was mentioned with flex fuel technology, but not only in Brazil. It really is, I would say, a decarbonization solution which we're seeing being taken up by transport systems around the world. And there's a reason for that, because not only can it be much cheaper than fossil fuels, but it is immediately available. It's available now, and most vehicles, especially vehicles in Europe, can support up to a 20% blend without any difficulty. So it's immediately implementable. I would say it comes at a very low transition cost, and that's why so many are interested in this, in ethanol here in Europe. I think it's been said, but it's worth maybe repeating that, sugarcane ethanol performs better than any other liquid biofuel produced on a commercial scale, and it reduces GHG emissions in comparison to fossil fuels by around 77% and up to 90%. That is quite considerable when we're looking at, again, this incredibly ambitious target that Ireland has to decarbonize its transport system. In the European Union, basically considering that renewable fuels, hybrid electric and electrically chargeable passenger cars only make up for 4.6% of passenger car fleets, and I believe it was mentioned that the threshold in Ireland is below that one of the EU. Achieving the decarbonisation target that's been set for 2030 will remain out of reach unless all the sustainable technologies are in fact included. And that's why when we're looking at EVs, so these electric vehicles and biofuels, well, actually it's combined that they're part of the solution that we need to decarbonize road transport. Essentially the International Energy Agency has already concluded electrification alone will not allow us to reach our targets in Europe or reach any type of climate neutrality for the transport system. So that's why when we look at renewable biofuels, they really are part of the mix. Again, we can see that in a way Ireland has been lagging behind, I think, in this transition, and I'm looking forward to hearing the example also from Sweden, but we've also seen, for instance, France, where E85, so this is the 85% blend of ethanol with fossil fuels, is growing at a steady pace, with now 1/4 of distributors across France providing the option for passengers to refuel with E85. Obviously, we do hope to see that Ireland will move towards an E10 blending this next year, and in a way that would only be catching up, I would say, to a certain point. I mean, 15 European countries, member states, already use E10 as their basic benchmark, and many more are moving towards higher blends as part of their renewable energy strategies. So I really hope that Ireland is in a place now to seize the opportunity that there is. Again, sugarcane, ethanol, and ethanol in general, I mean, they're solutions that are easily implementable and that most cars already support without the use of any new technologies. So hopefully we'll have a ripe debate today.
Thank you, Emily. Emily Rees. And let's go to our final panelist, Gustav Millen. Gustav, how are you?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. As you heard, I'm from Sweden, even though I'm in Brussels today. And Sweden is not so much agriculture, it's mainly forest. And we have currently actually 38% of our all energy use is from bioenergy, and mainly from the forest. And still, actually almost the same volume is of residues in the forest is still emitting its carbon dioxide in the forest when mouldering. So there is still a lot of potential to pick more biomass out of the Swedish forests. We are not on the same level as Brazil when it comes to biofuels, but we are best in Europe currently. We have about 23% of biofuels of all road transport. But today I like to focus a little bit on the long-term discussion, because I believe that biofuel is not a short-term solution when we in the future go over to hydrogen or electrification. I believe this proposal that we should phase out the combustion engine is something that isn't really properly thought through. Because you should remember that combustion is not so strange or dangerous. When you're out running, you say that you go out to burn carbs. And actually, when you eat biomass or put biomass in an engine, it's the same reaction. So in the body, we call it cell respiration, but it's exactly the same chemistry. So combustion is not something strange or dangerous if you use a modern engine or modern boiler. So I believe in measuring the emissions and control that they are not unhealthy, and then it will be fine to use combustion engines for a long time. Actually, there is not a single living cell on this planet that is not running on cell respiration or combustion. So biofuels is definitely a long-term solution.
Gustav, thank you. I want to see if I can change my running diet over to ethanol then as well, perhaps. Plinio, I want to go back to something you said earlier, which was about the life assessment, and you compared electrical vehicles to combustion engines as well. That was super interesting. People don't tend to think that way. Electrical vehicles are good, and anything to do with combustion engines are politically bad. But explain this to us a little bit more about what this means in terms of the life cycle and how biofuels and bioethanol can play into this.
Sure. Thank you for addressing this issue, Brian. Well, essentially, when you look only at tailpipe emissions, you are using the concept tank to wheel. If you want to take into account the carbon which is generated in the generation of the energy until the end use of it, then the concept you are using is well to wheel. And if you want to include the carbon emissions in the production of the systems utilized to use the energy, like the vehicles or the batteries and the discard of all this, you would be using the concept cradle to grave. Well, there's plenty of research already in the well to wheel. Cradle to graves is still being further developed. But under the well to wheel, what we know already is that the internal combustion engine using sustainably produced biofuels like ethanol and biomethane produce emissions which are much lower than the emissions of the battery electric car, which is currently being precluded as a solution in many countries. So in Brazil, the flex car using ethanol is emitting 58 grams of CO2 per kilometer, while in Europe, the battery electric vehicle is emitting 92 grams of CO2 per kilometer. The hybrids using ethanol, which have been sold in Brazil since 2019, are emitting 29 grams of CO2 per kilometer. So what we find today is that most automakers are having a difficulty in meeting their targets set for 2020, 2021. And on average, they are emitting 122 grams, while they should be emitting 96 grams today. Well, using ethanol and using in the future more and more biomethane, what the experience in Brazil is showing is that we are already, automakers are already meeting the most restrictive emission limits. And this is being done on a very sustainable manner, certified manner, guaranteeing that there's zero deforestation. So this model is now being perceived as being replicable to other countries.
Okay.
India is pursuing the same objective.
Let's come back to this in just a second. Emily, I just want to ask about the sustainability element of this as well, because the perception in Europe, rightly or wrongly, is that Brazil is burning rainforests, and there's no way that we could allow further erosion of the farming agricultural land to produce more ethanol. How does that stack up?
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate that question. And I think that there we have really a supreme case of misunderstanding of Brazil, if I may say so. Not in the sense that there isn't a problem of illegal deforestation, there is. But 92% of sugarcane production in Brazil, the sugarcane that's produced to make both ethanol and sugar, is harvested in south central Brazil, and that's around 2,500 kilometers from the Amazon. So just to give you an idea, it's roughly the same distance as Dublin to Morocco. That doesn't mean that there isn't an issue, but it means that it's an issue that, you know, it's not exactly where the production is taking place. And I think that this has already been very well acknowledged at a European Union level. So the European Commission has run a number of studies on this, because there are preoccupations, and I think that we should consider them rightfully. And the European Commission's own researchers, so they dug into this and they looked at not only direct land use change, but indirect land use change, any potential environmental degradation that could be occurring not only from the current production levels of sugarcane in Brazil, but also in a scenario of increased demand. So they were looking at a pretty spectacular increase of demand up to 2030 when they ran this study. And what they found was that sugarcane ethanol is a low ILUC risk product. So that means that it's got a very low risk of creating a land use change, either direct or indirect, right? And effectively, they found that the reason for this is that when you have an expansion of production in Brazil, in the south central part of Brazil, as mentioned, it's mostly occurring on old degraded pasture lands. So these are fields that are left idle, essentially, where there was sometimes some cows, but effectively is very degraded. When you bring in sugarcane production, what you're doing is you're putting that land back into an agricultural production land, but also it means that it falls under the scope of the forest code, which foresees that, you know, from 20 to 30% of the land, depending which biome you are in, but for us, I'm talking about the south of Brazil in this case, would have to be protected, meaning that you're actually going to ensure a reforestation, I would say, of most of those degraded pastures. I mean, I could obviously go into this topic in a lot more detail, but I would like to mention there's another thing. As mentioned, you know, a lot of the production is happening in the state of Sao Paulo, and a while ago in 2018, now a couple of years ago, the state of Sao Paulo and producers in the state of Sao Paulo came together and created what we call a green protocol. And it's not only looking at questions of protecting forests. There is a zero deforestation policy, I must insist on that, under the Brazilian biofuels policy. But it also looked at other things which maybe we don't, maybe we take slightly for granted here in Europe, or that are less protected, which are new springs and riparian areas. So all of these benefit also from higher protections than they would, for instance, under environmental law in Europe.
All right. Thank you. Sean Finan, you know, Ireland has the rain, but it doesn't have rainforests. So the risk there for deforestation is not going to be the same. How do you propose that Ireland would arrange the production? You pointed out earlier the 2017 Commission report, which identifies Ireland as the member state with the largest potential for biogas production. So how would this look in terms of sustainability and even food production, and the issues that some opponents of biofuels might present in Ireland?
Yes, thanks very much, Brian, for the question. Well, firstly, the sustainability criteria of all EU bioenergy is governed by the strict criteria within the Renewable Energy Directive. So, and everything that's done from a bioenergy perspective has to comply with that criteria. So the development of a biomethane industry, or indeed any other bioenergy-based industry in Ireland, would have to be in strict accordance and with those requirements. Ireland is a very strong agricultural country. We're predominantly a food-producing country, obviously, with lots of exports of beef and other products, dairy products, and so there is an opportunity for the development of a biomethane industry, and that biomethane industry to be based on the large volumes of agricultural wastes and residues, which are currently being generated through our food production systems. So that would mean that slurries from animal production, and indeed potentially food waste and indeed other organic waste, could be used to generate biogas, and that biogas be used in the transport sector, either pumped into our fossil gas grid as a blended option, or indeed as a off-grid option as well. But everything that would have that's developed from the point of view of biomethane has to be done in a sustainable manner. And I think a biomethane industry would very strongly complement the agricultural sector which we have here, and provide an opportunity for farmers without having any impact on food security within Ireland. Ireland is one of the most food secure nations in the world, but we have big challenges because from an emissions perspective in terms of agriculture, because it's such a large industry, and we don't have any significant heavy industry like other EU member states. So agriculture is our industry in terms of being a large contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. So in order to assist the agricultural sector, we can do that by further growth and development of bioenergy. And by doing that, then the agricultural sector becomes a solution to helping and assisting the decarbonisation effort of the transport sector. However, and I'll conclude on this, in order for a biomethane industry to be developed here, the cost of difference between fossil gas and biogas is significant, in that you have to have an ongoing feeding requirement in terms of biogas. So there needs to be something to bridge that gap. So there are various models across Europe that have been put in place by which that gap can be bridged to make it economically viable. And some of those measures are exchequer-based measures in some member states, and others are market-driven measures and market-driven supports. So we need to see and have a discussion in Ireland around this to see what is the best option from the point of view of bridging that gap between production cost and fossil price at the moment. And that's our challenge. Other than that, there aren't any other barriers to the development of an industry. We have the feedstock, we have the developers waiting and willing to invest and to develop these facilities. Through our membership, we have the technology providers, and it will be done in a sustainable manner. So really, it's ultimately down to the policy levers, as I mentioned in my presentation, that are required to make it happen.
Thank you, James. This is the challenge, isn't it? You said there's no crisis mode at the moment. Everybody's gone back to sleep as business as usual on the environmental front, it seems. And you spoke about the lack of levers. There's no way to dial this up quickly. And have we lost James? I can't see him there. Let's see. James, you still there? All right, I'll come back to James to see if it comes back in a second. Gustav, you sent me. James is back again. Can you hear me, James?
Hi. Yeah, I can hear you.
We lost your image for a second. All right. So how do you get this transition in a reasonable time frame as well? If the sustainability question is answered and that we can manage the production of biofuels in a safe way, food security, environmentally, the challenges should be met as well. But the infrastructure required to get us there, where electrification is not going to do it. We have this an intensely challenging timeline. What needs to be done in Ireland to achieve this transition quickly?
Well, I mean, so just taking a look at the regulatory environment overall and the challenge to 2030, neither the package of European Fit for 55 legislation nor Ireland's own climate action plan have content in them which are fit for purpose, which will achieve that level of change in the time frame we're talking about. So even in those kind of drafts, we're not there in terms of the overall legislation. And then if we come down into the measures that need to be put into place to actually comply with that legislation, we're kind of even further behind, which is, the gap between the rhetoric of the kind of Glasgow type event and what's actually happening on the ground is just huge, and I can't stress that enough. And that has nothing to do with my particular sector or even transport specifically, but climate action as a whole. So, but if we were to look at using bioenergy to contribute, say, 2 or 3 times more than it is already, so instead of 5% of the energy in the transport sector, 10% or 15%, well, certainly there's the low-hanging fruit of a couple of measures which have already been proposed and confirmed by the Irish government, but which they're not doing right now, which is the inexplicable part, which is, doubling the ethanol content of the petrol to 10% and increasing by another 5% the amount of biodiesel in the diesel. And after that, so they're the easy ones, they're the things that can be done immediately. And then after that, it's a question of getting biomethane into the heavy goods vehicles, the trucks and the buses, and that's a question of fleet turnover as quick as possible. And there are lots of people buying new buses and trucks all the time. I mean, there's a reasonable turnover which could be harnessed, as well as encouraging slightly quicker fleet turnover over the next 8 years. So that's another thing we do. We could introduce E85 into the petrol system, and we could introduce drop-in biodiesel into the diesel system. So there are a few things that we could actually be doing quite proactively, which would bring about 15% renewable energy instead of 5%, in parallel with massive additional efforts on electromobility, modal shift, and active modes of transport.
Thank you.
I don't know if that
Gustav,
gets your...
We'll get this part of the way. We have some time to draw the rest of it out. Yeah, Gustav, in Sweden, what's your experience? I think you sent me a note that you've introduced E10 this summer, and you still have around 1,500 E85 filling stations. How long does this deployment take? How long does this transition take? Are you optimistic that this can be done more quickly? The learning curve, it should be shorter now?
Yes, I mean, we started with E85 in the 1990s, so we have a long history there, and we had a good policy also until 2010. And after 2010, the policy for ethanol development has not been so good in Sweden. So we mainly switched over to renewable diesel. That was together with the food and feed debate. So that hit the Swedish ethanol development. And we found out later, of course, that there is no problem with food and feed competition, so to say. They actually help each other. As James said before, we produce in their factory, they produce ethanol, and then they get a lot of food or a lot of protein that can be used for human food, vegan food, or for feeding animals. But anyway, that's why we switched over to more diesel. So the main biofuel in Sweden today is HVO. We also have ordinary FAME, but HVO is the big one. And personally, I run my car on HVO 100%. And it's available in many filling stations, even though the E85 stations are many more still. Yeah.
Something
like
in
that.
terms of how and who supplies this? Is it the traditional energy companies like the Exxons and the Texaco?
Yeah.
These kind of companies, they are the traditional oil suppliers, are still putting the pumps at the service stations with these fuels.
We had a period, the first 15 years, also another company was involved, Sekab, and delivered a lot of E85 and developed very well. They are not there today, and actually it's the ordinary oil companies or Circle K or so that delivers or have filling stations. And today, actually, for the first time, the ethanol or E85 price are higher than the gasoline price. So it's 1.8 euros for 1 liter. And currently in France, the price is 0.8 euros. So there is something strange on the Swedish market there. The current price for, fuels are more expensive in Sweden since we have introduced what we call a reduction quota, but I maybe can talk about that a little later. But that is anyway a way to introduce more biofuels both in the gasoline and diesel sector. And actually in 2030, then we will have a reduction of 66% in diesel. And to make that, you need to blend about 80% biodiesel already in 2030 to reach this kind of reduction. But we believe that that's doable.
Okay,
but it gets a little expensive.
Okay. And in terms, just to ask on this again, in terms of what the government does to support this as well, if the objective is to reduce carbon emissions, will the government support that pricing to get the emissions down? Gustav?
Yeah, now it's a market-driven system with this reduction quota. So, and actually it's also taxed a bit. It's the ordinary diesel, but currently in the diesel sector, it's 40% biodiesel, roughly. And on gasoline side, it's a lot lower. It's about 10-12% at the moment. So, but there is no other support but this quota. So then the customers need to pay a little more. But we believe that there will be support soon for Swedish production of biofuels, both gasoline, ethanol, and diesel versions from Swedish raw material, mainly from the Swedish forest then. And our expectation is that the cost to produce 1 liter of renewable fuel from the forest is 1.1 euro, something like that. So that's not so expensive, even though it's a lot more expensive than producing from sugarcane ethanol, for example, or ordinary ethanol also in Europe.
Okay, thank you.
But
James, do you want to jump
really
in there?
doable. Yeah.
Okay.
So coming back to the question of where the biofuels come from and the sustainability question we mentioned earlier on, there is definitely a very strong and well-regulated sustainability system in Europe for biofuels. That's not to say it can't be improved, and it should be improved, and it is being improved. There is also a question of policing it so that the actual physical fuels that do go into the system comply with that, and that they comply with it genuinely. So we come back to Ireland's situation in particular. The biofuels that come into Ireland at the moment come from about 70 different countries. So you can imagine that there is just under 200 countries on the planet. So we're taking them in from nearly half of those. And there's about a dozen different types. So there's several different types of ethanol, depending on the type of biomass or crop it's made from. And there's several different types of biodiesel. Of the 70 countries and the 12 types that come into Ireland, it boils down to a large extent to used cooking oil coming from Southeast Asia. The vast bulk of Ireland's renewable energy and transport is used cooking oil coming from Southeast Asia. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a very good thing, except for the system needs to be policed. And that goes for all forms of renewable energy, whether it's going to be electricity or hydrogen or e-fuels or biofuels. It's for as long as there's an opportunity to take kind of fossil or non-sustainable kind of raw materials or raw energy and translate that into supposedly sustainable renewable with false documentation or some kind of murky behavior along the supply chain, and it can happen in any sector, then that needs to be policed. And there is a gap in Europe in terms of policing that, and that affects all countries who are using biofuels, and in particular the used cooking oil area. So I would stress that the sustainable system is not bad, it's getting better, needs to get better. The policing needs to get better, but that's going to be across all renewable energy sectors. Policing is essential.
Okay, Emily, you mentioned about certification in terms of the sugarcane process as well. There's often a concern when it comes to energy about the greenwashing of products that would come into the European system as well. Would Irish buyers have confidence that the certification, the quality of what's been produced, and the veracity of the data is on point?
Thank you, Brian. So I think it's important to come back then to RenovaBio, which is the Brazilian renewable energy or the biofuels national policy of Brazil. And RenovaBio, because it's blended into a carbon bond system, which is under Brazil's nationally contributed determined contributions to the COP that we just had recently, all of this is independently audited. So there is verifications that occur not only I would say in order to feed into the national program, in order for producers to be able to emit carbon bonds. So they emit these CBIOs, which correspond to 1 ton of CO2 not emitted in the process. And that basically is, I would say, the carbon bond trading scheme that we have today functioning in Brazil. So what that means is that in order to be able to emit these carbon bonds, the mills must prove not only the efficiency of their processes, the circular economy, for instance, that they have put into place in terms of their industrial processes, but also the zero deforestation policy, which again, I think is important to insist goes way beyond Brazilian national law. So this does not allow a single tree to be cut. And it is monitored not only through satellite systems, but it also goes through an independent certification system, which is very important because it can lead to fines in different parts of the system, which is why there are many checks and balances in this.
Okay,
if you'll allow me just to come back to the E85 very briefly, because it was mentioned.
Yes, just briefly.
Why is France such a success on E85? Very briefly, I think that there have been 2 points. One, which is that there is a digressive taxation rate system based on the carbon efficiency of fuels that was put into place a couple of years ago. And that actually that's why you've got the 0.85, euro per litre at the tank occurring in France, where you might not find that elsewhere, where you'll find that the fuel might not have a specific taxation, which is different from that of fossil fuels. So that's the number one criteria and the number one factor. The second factor of what's occurring in France, which I think is one certainly for public authorities to take into consideration, is that France has allowed basically the subsidization by cities, by regions of the conversion box. So this is that small conversion box that you can get fitted onto your motor, which will basically make the car adaptable in flex fuel up to 85. And so with the subsidization of the conversion boxes, the region, some of the southern regions of France allow people to go in and get a €1 conversion box. And that is also some of the incentives you can put into place very easily to encourage the take-up of biofuels.
Okay, we have some questions on that. Kevin O'Sullivan asked, I have a diesel car at the moment. What adjustment or modifications required to run on bio or ethanol? Emily, same answer that you just gave?
So
Anyone
for
else want to add to
biodiesel,
that?
it's like...
Go ahead, Emily, go ahead.
So I mentioned, so in this case, we were talking about passenger cars, which are currently on petrol. For diesel, we know that heavy duty vehicles are slightly more difficult to tackle in terms of the renewable energy solutions that are available. So I'm not aware of a current conversion box that would be available, but one could only imagine that that's really where we are heading in terms of the development of that market. But maybe Plinio can provide more detailed information on biodiesel.
Sure. Solution for diesel, fossil diesel, would be blending biodiesel or substituting diesel by biomethane. Ethanol is appropriate for Otto cycle engines, not diesel engines. So for diesel, these would be the routes of solution.
Thank you. Gustav, you wanted to add to this?
Yes, I have an ordinary diesel car, and then I can run that on HVO 100%. So that's not a problem. It actually, HVO is a little lighter than normal diesel, but it's the same energy content. So it's not within the European diesel standard, but it's in the US diesel standard. So the same car in US, they give guarantee if you run on 100% HVO biodiesel, but you don't get that guarantee in Europe. But then a lot of brands have decided to give guarantee anyway. So Volvo, for example, and Renault and Peugeot as well. And Mercedes is a bit behind. It's only one car or something like that. But if you have a diesel car, you can't run it on ethanol if you don't change it a bit. There has been trials with that, so it's possible to produce ED95, so it's 95% ethanol, and then there is some ignition material on 5%, ignition substances. So we run in Sweden, we run ordinary diesel trucks and buses on this ED95, and we also changed an ordinary car. It was a Saab diesel car, personal car. But if you change that, you have to run it only on ED95. And since it's not possible to fuel that won't happen really. But because then you need to fuel only with ED95 then, so to speak.
Thank you. James, you want to add something there?
Yeah, for the benefit of Kevin, who asked about his own diesel car, the question of biofuels going into fuels, into the existing petrol and diesel supply, is about that stuff those biofuels being blended in at source. So it's not really about the individual consumer, driver, vehicle owner going and making a choice and rolling up and asking for it at a forecourt. At the moment, all of Irish petrol contains 5% ethanol already. That could be bumped up to 10, and all of Irish diesel contains 6 or 7% biodiesel in it already. So they're decisions that are made centrally in the blending of the fuel itself, rather than something that individual car owners do themselves.
Okay, Gustav, quick follow-up there.
Yeah, in ordinary diesel, the usual blend of RME or FAME is 7%. But actually, if you have a very good quality on RME, you could run your car on 100% RME as well. I know several of the suppliers of RME that does that, but that's not approved by the car producers yet.
Okay, thank you. To scan through some of the other comments here, Clairwood says, where's the source for these numbers in CO2 per kilometer? Can we have links afterwards to resources? I guess so. I'll ask the team if they can work that out. Thank you. Claire also said that 0.6% of Brazil's landmass is 500,000 million kilometers square. I'll take your word for it, Claire. This is an area 6 times the size of Ireland. How is it scalable to the world's population without causing deforestation? Maybe somebody in the panel wants to take that. Nick Armstrong says, if biofuels are not derived from waste, etc., but is produced from logging of forests, then there is a rise in greenhouse gases. I think we touched on this already, which will not be reabsorbed into new trees for decades, but sustainable low carbon sources of biofuels contribute more than a small amount of fuel. And see what the panelists say about that. And also Des Phelan. Des says, timber haulage in Ireland is currently hauled by diesel trucks, gross vehicle weight 46 tons from mountainous terrain. What liquid fuel can we pursue? HVO. Let's take that question first from Des. Panel, who wants to have a go at that? Sean? And then Plinio?
What we,
Sean,
as James has said, a lot of the blending is done at source. So for that truck driver or the truck operator to do their own, increase the blending rates of their own fuel is impossible unless we get that blending done at source. The only thing that could be done is that truck, when that's been replaced, could be changed to a potentially biomethane truck, and that biomethane could be indigenously generated and supplied. So as James has said, it's at source that the blending would take place. But the carbon footprint of that particular vehicle will be significantly increased as a result of increasing the blending rate if it's a diesel truck of biodiesel. We have members that are currently involved in biodiesel production, and they have the capacity to further increase and enhance that production as well. So at an individual level, as James has said, it's not possible for a decision to be taken by an individual truck driver, but they can be supportive of a lobby effort to increase the blending rate, and that would assist us in our efforts to ensure that happens and help from a carbon perspective.
Okay, so until the fleet turnover happens and they can change the vehicle, then lobby for the change in the blend. Plinio, you wanted to add there?
Sure. First of all, the source of the data that I mentioned is Mali, which is a major auto part manufacturer in Brazil, and supported by the Brazilian Association of Automotive Engineers. Talking about the land mass occupied with sugarcane for energy in Brazil. Well, first of all, let me recall that 19% of Brazil's supply of energy comes from sugarcane. It's the second largest source of energy in Brazil, after only oil, which accounts for 33%. So sugarcane is 19%. And this landmass, which is 5.1 million hectares, for Brazil, it's really a drop in the bucket. Just to recall, what is the size of Ireland? Ireland is 8.44 million hectares. So it would be pretty much 60% of the land of Ireland, which is responsible for substituting almost 50% of Brazil's gasoline. And let's recall that Brazil is the third largest user of fuels in transport in the world. So these are big numbers. Brazil is one of the 10 largest economies in the world, but it just says that it's doable. The amount of land which is occupied by mankind for all uses is 1.5 billion hectares all over the world. So, we're talking about eventually the need of 40 to 50 million hectares going into the future to achieve a more extended use of bioenergy for transport around the world.
Okay, but like you say, it's doable. From Tom Beresford, are there specific technology developments required in an Irish context? I know we've touched on some of this. Sean, James, in particular, anything you want to add to that question, Tom? Any specific technological developments required?
I think if you look at it, sorry, James, do you want? Okay, I'll just come in first. I think if you look at it, sorry, James, go on.
Well, coming back or covering both of those questions, the last guy with the truck hauling timber, there are fleets of trucks in Ireland putting 20% biodiesel in them as well. So if you have a fleet of trucks or you're part of a fleet of trucks, then there's a possibility that you can certainly buy, that fleet owner can source much higher biofuel blend fuels if they want. They are available, the oil companies supply them, and they're very eager and happy to supply them. So that can be done. Technical changes, I mean, all of the vehicles on the fleet, all of the vehicles on Irish roads can handle a bit more than they're taking as things stand. And then it's a question of changeover of the fleet. The other, major technical things that Ireland needs to consider, not really. We're definitely among the lower users of renewable energy and transport, including bioenergy, across Europe. So there are kind of very mature approaches that we could take that have already been rolled out in the other countries that don't represent big technical challenges.
Okay, Sean, you want to follow up there? Thank you, James.
Nothing. I've nothing further to add. Only just to say that the production technology, from the point of view of some of these fuels, is mainstream across Europe and indeed across the world. So it's not a challenge to mobilize these fuels if that's required. And just one point I'd like to come back to in terms of the figures, because Plinio mentioned figures there and references from a Brazilian context. I know that our own transport report, which I alluded to at the start, will be launched, we hope, next week. And that will contain figures from an Irish perspective in terms of CO2 emissions per 1 kilometre travelled. And this report has been developed by UCC Marai. So they are a reputable research body that have analysed this from through the report which they've developed for ourselves. And in that regard, biofuels, the emissions, 35 grams per CO2 or grams of CO2 per 1 kilometre travelled in 2020 compared to EVs currently of 58. So biofuels certainly less from an emissions perspective than EVs currently. And obviously the emissions from EVs will obviously be directed and dictated by the volumes of renewable electricity which go onto the system. And Ireland has ambitious targets for the development of renewable electricity, up to 80% renewable electricity by 2030. So as that renewable electricity mix increases, your electric vehicle emissions intensity would reduce, obviously.
Okay, thank you. One more question, and I'll go back to Emily and talk about greenhouse gas emission reduction. David says, can biomethane producers in Ireland sell their renewable certs to the diesel petrol fuel importers to offset their biofuels obligation if it is shown to be used in CNG usage in Ireland, thus increasing the value of biomethane injected into the gas system? I know that's technical. Anybody want to have a go at that? Sean, James? No.
Possible.
No,
it is possible.
The answer is yes.
Yes.
That's it. It's a very simple answer. Yes.
Okay, good stuff. And please send in your questions. We have a few minutes left still for that. But if you want a question answered, please send it in right now. Emily, greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced by 77% when using liquid biofuel compared to other fossil fuels as well. This seems like a no-brainer. We're up against it in terms of the timeline. We need to find quick solutions. We have a proven system where the greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced when it comes to transport. What's holding this up?
Well, that really is the question. I think essentially a lot of confusion in Europe around this sort of food versus fuel debate that started nearly a decade ago. And under that, yes, perhaps there are sectors that produce some type of biofuel that might be indeed, I would say, affected by this debate. But in the case of many others, such as sugarcane ethanol, this food versus fuel debate is entirely antiquated. And I think that that's actually been holding a lot of this back. The question of, can you produce food and fuel at the same time without having any distortive characteristics on your domestic market or international markets? And if anything, we have proven now that that is not the case. So many studies, and I know we had a question about sources, so allow me to come back on the GHG reduction emission source there. We're not making this up. This comes from the new Renewable Energy Directive. It's every pathway has been tested, and the European Commission has attributed an efficiency test to each pathway. And in that regard, we would say that when we were tested in the same way in California, we get a higher result there. That just depends on each, I would say, country's own methodologies. So I will, for the purpose of this debate, remain on the figures which are provided by the European Commission. Again, I think that that really is the question that's holding things back. I think what was very interesting here, and as mentioned by other fellow panelists, is the question of a potential displacement of carbon emissions from transport into energy production, and these need to be considered. So, for instance, if you are going to go down the electrification pathway, then obviously you are going to be moving your emissions from that transport bucket into the electricity production bucket. So we need to account these things. In the case of Brazil, what's happened is that with the generation of bioelectricity as a byproduct of the sugarcane processing industry, what's happening is that the bioelectricity generated is also feeding into the electrification of fleets in Brazil. So we have a much more, I would say, integrated market. And again, if I had one thing to say here is maybe to look at all solutions and not necessarily be closed off to any. Do the data checking, and of course any further source of information and such, we're very happy to provide.
Thank you, Emily. Gustav, quick follow-up on that?
Yeah, I would like to mention about, I mean, the EU policy is currently that we should phase out biofuels from energy crops. But if you consider the data from the Food and Agriculture Organization, from the UN or USDA, US Department of Agriculture, and I have looked on the data from 60 years back. And then if you compare the growth of the world population from 60 years back and today, and also the grain production per hectare. So actually the grain production per hectare has been 1.9% increase every year, whereas the population has been growing by 1.6%. So we grow more food per hectare every year and that increase is quicker than the population increase. So there is no food versus fuel conflict. And I guess you all know that because I mean, EU has paid European farmers since 1990 or some years before 1990 not to produce food because we have a surplus production of food. And it's a similar situation all over the world. At least everywhere there where people have money, they also get food. So there are always other reasons for people not getting food, so to say. So I believe that we should definitely use some of the European land, arable land, also in the future to produce energy and biofuels. And Ireland should, in my opinion, not only use waste volumes to produce biomethane. You could also have ethanol factories from corn or wheat or so to produce your own fuel.
Excellent, thank you. It seems to me this is partly an economic answer as well. There's job creation opportunities within this. there are different market stimulus opportunities, the innovation that can be driven through this as well. So there's much more to be gained than simply those absolutely critical, the reduction of greenhouse gases. One more quick comment from our audience, and then we're going to go to do our wrap-up remarks. And just to show that we do pay attention, Claire Watts, she says a question on sustainability. No, there's one on Indigenous people which has disappeared. Claire was asking why we didn't have Indigenous people here. Soon to have a panel on Brazilian deforestation of Indigenous people. Amazon sees worst deforestation levels in 15 years. Claire, I think we touched on this earlier. First of all, the production of sugarcane doesn't take place almost exclusively outside of the Amazon, so Indigenous people wouldn't be directly impacted by the state of Sao Paulo. Is not an area where Indigenous people are numerous. So I think that's why we wouldn't have someone from the Indigenous population here. It's simply not a significant part of this conversation, though your point is noted. Thank you. And quick comment from Emily on that, and then we're going to go to wrap-up remarks. Emily.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'd like to pick up on this point because I think that we have a big mix of debates here, although I am glad to be representing the gender diversity today, which obviously could be improved. But I mean, let's be very clear about this. As anyone who is interested in the deforestation debate in Brazil or worldwide knows, the European Union adopted a regulation or a proposal for a regulation on the 17th of November to cover the question of embedded deforestation in commodities which are exported to the European Union. As you'll see from that list of targeted commodities which has been drawn up by the European Union, we know which are the commodities worldwide that are drivers of deforestation. We know which are the derived products which also create an appetite, I would say, for the embedded deforestation that is consumed here in Europe. There's a reason sugarcane ethanol and sugarcane products are not involved in that proposal or not included in that list. It's because they are low ILUC risk products, and they've been certified as such not only by the European Commission, but also, again, it's an independently audited process. The producers of sugarcane ethanol do not engage in illegal or legal deforestation and are, again, present in the south central region of Brazil, that is in the south of Brazil, where it can actually get quite cold, perhaps not as cold as today, but I think that there is quite a lot of misunderstandings in this discussion, so hopefully that will have clarified.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, let's go to a wrap up. We'll go in the same order that we started as well. So let's go to Sean.
Thanks very much, Brian. And yeah, thanks very much, Brian. I think clearly we have advocated today that bioenergy can play a very important part in a future energy system, and that in order to tie this back to our theme of today, a sustainable Irish transport system and how to achieve carbon neutrality, I think the message needs to be very clear. It will need all options from a technology and fuel point of view for that to happen. And so alongside an ambitious rollout of electrification, electric vehicles, we need to ensure and increase the blending rates in terms of biofuels and develop an indigenous biomethane industry. And really, all I can do is call on our regulators and our policy makers and our government to make that happen by working to put the legislative framework in place that those blending rates can increase. And we as an organization and as an industry and our members are more than willing to work with all stakeholders in order to ensure that we can decarbonize the transport system and that bioenergy has a strong part to play in that mix. Thank you. And thanks, Brian, for your own facilitation. And also, I'd just like to finally, again, acknowledge the Embassy of Brazil, Dublin, Apex Brazil, and indeed our speakers and attendees for today's session. And yourself, Brian, as well, for facilitating from Euractiv. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, Sean. James, over to you. 30 seconds.
Okay, so okay, we make ethanol, but it's no longer our primary thing. We make plant protein, and we will make more ethanol in the future, which will be available for the fuel, but primarily because we'll be making more plant protein, and the ethanol will be kind of a co-product of that. Quickly, the European Commission will become less relevant over the next 8 years because the crisis is something that the Commission is not designed to sort. It'll be something for member states to do. And thirdly, the Irish fleet grew by 50,000 petrol and diesel burning vehicles last year alone, and that is easily dwarfs the growth in the electromobility. That's not to celebrate it, it's just to say that the Irish people, for reasons of cost and convenience, are still voting for diesel and petrol, and that's not going to change anytime quick, and we need to address that. Anyway, thank you.
Excellent. James, thank you indeed. Plinio, over to you, 30 seconds.
Thank you, Brian. Final note, I think electrification is a tendency, but the battery is only one option. You can do electrification with biofuels through hybrids and fuel cells nearly in the future. There's also a lot of room to improve the efficiency in internal combustion engines using sustainably produced biofuels. So there is proven record about this in the world, and it's scalable, replicable, affordable, uses the same infrastructure. It's drop-in, so it should be considered as a viable option. Thank you.
Excellent, Plinio. Thank you. Emily, 30 seconds.
Very briefly, I mean, ethanol, again, is already decarbonizing transport systems around the world. It's cheaper than petrol, most of the cases, and it can be made available now. So I really do hope that Ireland takes the next step forward to at least put that basic benchmark, E10.
Thank you. Gustav.
Okay, thanks. Sweden is very much pro biofuels. Anyway, it took until 1st of August this year to introduce E10. We argued for E10 in many years, but it was actually mainly the oil company association and the oil companies that had several different arguments not to introduce it. And you can understand that because it's not really their product. But it was very easily done when it happened. And I should recommend Ireland not to wait so long as we do, so do it as soon as possible, and also start to produce some ethanol from your own agriculture. And good luck.
Thank you. Sugarcane, the Swedish solution to climate change. And just to thank our panel today. So we have Plinio, Emily, Sean, James, and Gustav. An excellent conversation. It's a huge topic, and I really appreciate the different dynamics that you brought to the conversation today. I thought that was well set out. And to our team, Malta, Zoran, Tamar from Euractiv, and our social media team, who you never get to see, but they're always there right behind. And our thanks today to the Embassy of Brazil in Dublin, Apex Brazil, and the Irish Bioenergy Association for the partnership today. We appreciate it a lot. An important topic, more to come on this in the future. I wish you a good day wherever you are. I'm Brian Maguire.